Iceland was one of the countries who suffered most by the major financial crisis in 2008. Its banks collapsed and its GDP collapsed. Society was in chaos and there were many protests in the streets. However, fast forward to today, Iceland has mostly recovered from that crisis. One of the factors that helped Iceland recover was the rise of its tourism industry. The collapse of its currency made it attractive for tourists to visit the country, boosting its economy. Over the years the number of tourists skyrocketed, up to levels where the annual number of tourists exceeded its population by multitudes, making it one of Iceland's most important industries. So how does this relate to Mongolia? Both Iceland and Mongolia are sparsely populated remote regions with natural beauty. Both have well-known historical aspects such as Vikings and Genghis Khan and unique cultures. Whilst Iceland is flooded with tourists every single year, Mongolia doesn't have as much. However, there is a lot that Mongolia can learn from Iceland's success. Mongolia's economy is not well diversified. The vast majority of its exports come from its natural resources. The next largest export is its animal products, but that only makes up around 4% of exports. In addition, 72% of its exports go to China. However, it is very difficult for Mongolia to diversify its economy since it is a landlocked nation in the middle of Eurasia surrounded by China and Russia. This means that it is extremely difficult to be part of major international trade routes and export its products to multiple different countries. In addition, due to its isolated location, Mongolia does face some difficulties industrializing due to its small population and its harsh landscape. This means that Mongolia has less options of diversifying than other countries. However, one of these options that is not exclusively dependent on geopolitical factors and is not super hard to develop is tourism. Unfortunately, Mongolia does not have many tourists at this moment. It only receives less than 500,000 visitors each year. Compare that with nearby Kazakhstan, which receives around 6 million a year, and Kyrgyzstan, which receives around 3 million. However, there are some changes that can be made which would increase the number of tourists. Firstly is amending the visa policy. Mongolia doesn't offer visa-free access to many countries. This would definitely discourage tourists from visiting since it would be less convenient. However, countries like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan offer visa-free access to a lot more countries, therefore it would be easier for tourists to visit. Another reason is that Mongolia does not have a large number of air routes, with the exception to Korea. Compared to Iceland and Kazakhstan, which have more air routes available, this makes it easier for tourists to visit. At the time of writing, Mongolia has offered visa-free travel to South Koreans up until the end of 2024. This is a very strong step since a lot of Koreans already visit Mongolia and that there are already plenty of flight connections from Korea to Mongolia. Recently, there have been a number of Korean vloggers who have visited Mongolia. The lifting of visa requirements may have been one of the factors. Ideally, this would be a permanent thing since it would benefit the Mongolian economy. Although lifting visa requirements for other countries might not have the same effect, it would increase tourism into the country. Mongolia has a rich nomadic culture. From hearty cuisines to its unique music, Mongolia has a lot of cultural output. Right now, the world is starting to take notice of this, for example the popularity of the heavy metal band The Who. However, an increased amount of tourism would give this a boost. For instance, one reason why Italian and Thai cuisine is popular around the world is due to the fact these countries receive millions of tourists every year. These tourists sometimes bring a cultural aspect back to their own countries which may spread around their home countries. These cultural exports could also lead to the further diversification of the Mongolian economy, reducing dependence on natural resources. However, there are still a number of differences between Iceland and Mongolia. Firstly, Iceland only has about 370,000 people, whereas Mongolia has more than 3 million people. This means the economic impact per tourist would be much greater in Iceland than in Mongolia. In addition, Iceland is wealthier than Mongolia, so therefore they are able to develop infrastructure designed for tourists. In addition, Iceland is closer to more lucrative and larger markets such as Europe and the USA, whereas Mongolia only has South Korea and Japan nearby. China and Russia contain regions similar to Mongolia, so tourism to Mongolia might not be as attractive. Despite the fact that increased tourism will not completely transform the Mongolian economy, however, Mongolia desperately needs to diversify its economy, and tourism is definitely one simple step the country can take to grow its GDP to become less reliant on natural resources, and which could potentially lead to other avenues of growth. Or they can do the Bhutanese approach, which also has its advantages.